Good morning. We're going to go, so this is the first lecture. We're going to go over Native American groups briefly. So our first unit here for History 1301 is going to be Native American history. We're really going to cover Native American history from sort of pre-European contact, really all the way up until the end of the time period for this course. So this is pre-Reconstruction U.S. history, and so when we get to December, this course will end basically with Reconstruction in 1877. We're going to basically go right up to that point here in Unit 1, chronologically, and maybe even a little beyond it, as we sort of cover the totality of Native Americans throughout that period. So what that means is we're going to be looking at a brief overview. So there's going to be some generalizations. I don't particularly like generalizations, but we're going to have to make some generalizations in order to understand the basic ideas of Native Americans, because there's simply not enough time to cover the vast number of Native American tribes that existed in North America. They all have their own language, their own culture, their own history, their own ideology. There's some obviously variations in religion, way of life, all of that different stuff. So we're going to cover, as we break this down, we're going to cover regionally, sort of the eastern woodlands, the southeast, the plains, the southwest, and then the northwest. And so we'll cover those sort of 5 areas geographically. We'll cover a handful of tribes within those different regions. But we're looking at trying to understand some of those subtle differences that existed between those tribes. One of the things that I do want to point out to you is that, again, while they have their own sort of culture and language and way of life, I want you to understand there's a difference between dialects and languages. And the best example that I can sort of give you of this in terms of modern day structures, right, would be looking at say Portugal and Spain as an example, right? So in Spain they speak Spanish, in Portugal they speak Portuguese, but there's a common dialectical sort of ancestry to those two languages. When I was in the Marine Corps, I had a corpsman who was Portuguese. His mom was born in Portugal. He was fluent in Portuguese. And we were out in San Diego one time, and we were at a very small Mexican restaurant there. And so he went and ordered. And so he was speaking Portuguese, right? The guy that was working was speaking Spanish. And so afterwards we sat down and I asked Helder, I said, I thought you didn't speak Spanish. He goes, well, I don't speak Spanish. I was speaking Portuguese. He was speaking Spanish. They're close enough we could understand one another. That's true of a lot of Native American tribes. There might have been subtle differences in the language, but overall, the languages are similar enough that there can be some significant overlap between, Algonquins and Powhatans, or Navajo, Apache, like all of those different groups, because it really breaks down into sort of 3 dialectical groups in North America. All right. So when we look at the size and the structure of Native American groups, prior to the arrival of white folk, there were, and I believe that 8 million is North America, just North America. It might be just the United States, but I think it's North America, or really what we're going to look at, which is sort of northern Mexico and then into Canada. So really what you're looking at on that map, I think that's where the 8 million come from. Obviously, the borders that we have today are not the borders that would have existed in the 15th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. And so Native Americans would obviously live both in sort of New Mexico and Mexico, Arizona and Mexico, or, New York and whatever the Canadian province is above New York. I don't know. So roughly 8 million. The sort of structural breakdown of those 8 million really comes into three parts, and there's sort of a hierarchical part. So there was clans, bands, and nations. Clans are small familial groups, so they would have numbered, a dozen, couple dozen, but we're talking double digits here, right? Most Native American tribes had some sort of patriarch who was in charge of the clan. Some Native American tribes actually had a matriarch. The difference there is male or female that was in charge. But patriarchy is the more common leadership that we have, right? So those clans lived and worked sort of in harmony or in unison. Sometimes clans would come together and form bands. And in many instances, bands are actually sort of what we think of as tribes, right? So this would be hundreds of people working together communally that now no longer have the same familial relations, right? So it's not like grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, aunt, uncle, like brother, sister, cousins, whatnot. Now you're looking at non-familial relations that are still engaged in a communal way of life, right? And so when I say communal way of life, what we're really talking about here is that Native Americans, they didn't have a concept of land ownership, right? Like that was something that was foreign to them. And therefore, they would have like community plots where everybody would go and till the land and plant. Usually, women actually, not everybody. Women were predominantly in charge in Native American culture of farming. But the women would all go out there and they would all work the land together and then harvest the land together and then just sort of give people food based upon their need, right? And so now you're doing that in the hundreds. And then nations would be what you would consider large regional groups, right? And so the idea here, the way that I can explain this to you, is if you look at the Iroquois nation as an example, and we'll talk about the Iroquois in detail. The Iroquois are actually made up of 5 different tribes, which would be sort of what those bands are, right? So we talk about the Iroquois as a group, and then we talk about. I mean, you'll sometimes hear Mohawks or Mohicans talked about as groups, right? But those tribes can work together to form larger tribes as well, right? So we'll start with Eastern Native Americans. We had the Powhatans, the Algonquins, the Iroquois. And really, those are the 3 that we're going to touch here. The Powhatans lived in what is modern-day Virginia. So these are the Native Americans that were encountered by Jamestown. The Algonquins are... Okay, so Algonquin is a very complex term. It is both a group of people and a language. There are a number of Native American tribes that speak versions of Algonquin. It would sort of, again, to try to put this into perspective for you, it would be like English, right? So you have English as both a language and a group of people. And then you have English-speaking people that are not English, i.e. Scottish or Irish or American or Australian or whatever. So the Algonquins are a Native American group in the New England area that will play rather prominent. And again, that's a larger sort of nation. And then the Iroquois nation we'll talk about because there's a lot of evidence that the Iroquois nation actually has a significant impact on American government later on. So when we look at the first contact, our first contact is actually predominantly in the New England area. Well, we'll call it the New England area, right? But it's really the northeast of the North American continent, right? So we have evidence that Leif Erikson was a Viking who came from Scandinavia or Iceland, somewhere up in what we would call sort of northern Europe, right? They come to Greenland. They went as far south as like Newfoundland, which is a Canadian province. But they established the first settlements that we know of for Native Americans. Um, Excuse me, first contact with Native Americans. I should have mentioned this, and I don't think I did. Um, when we go back and we actually look at, well, I don't have a world map up here, but I want you to understand that the commonly held belief, right? Because Native American history is not well documented, and so a lot of it is sort of oral history that's been passed down from generation to generation, which obviously then everything is a secondary source or a secondary telling of what happened, which can lead to some significant changes in the real story. But the best evidence that we have, or the best idea we have, is that first natives, what we call Native Americans, actually migrated to North America from Asia, right? So there was there's the Bering Strait, which is a little bit of water in between eastern Russia and Alaska. The belief is that strait was frozen over, so you could walk on it. Native Americans crossed over that and then began to move south through Canada into what is now the United States, Central America, and even South America. They would have migrated that far down until they reached sort of the southern tip of Chile or Argentina. There's actually some scientific evidence of that now. Scientists have found some genetic similarities on Y chromosomes between Asians and Native Americans, which lends a little bit more weight to that theory that that's where our sort of first peoples in North America came from. So first European contact then is really the Vikings. They're the first ones to arrive. Again, Greenland and then Newfoundland to a little lesser extent, or after Greenland would have been the first place that they hit because it would have been the first body of land that they came to, right? As the Earth warms and more of the Greenland ice sheet is melting away, it will be interesting to see how much more Viking settlement and Viking history is uncovered that's currently buried beneath ice, right? The famous guy is Columbus. Columbus comes across in 1492, and there's a lot of disagreement about Columbus, about sort of his character, what he did, what he was, who he was, how smart he was, what he actually understood upon his death. I want you to understand a couple of things. Columbus comes 5 times, right? The first time that he came, he was looking for India. That's why we call Native Americans Indians, because that's what he called them. Right, so he's looking to travel west, and I also want you to understand, just so we're clear, right? Columbus is not some scientific visionary who's like, oh my God, the Earth is round, right? And everybody else is like, dude, you're gonna fall off the edge of the world. No, right? The idea of a sphere, right, a globe, is actually fairly well understood. Now they had no concept whatsoever of how large that sphere was, because obviously they didn't know about North America, and the Pacific is significantly larger than the Atlantic Ocean, right? So Columbus packs his food and his water and whatnot and sets out, and he thinks that he's going to get to India when he's about, I don't know, 2/3 the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Like he's not even all the way to North America, and he's, in his mind, the way he's done his calculations, thinks he should already be in India, right? So he arrives in the Caribbean Sea, and I think it was Hispaniola. I think that's the first island that he hit. I don't really care. I wouldn't test you on that. You probably should understand Columbus is an Italian. He's sailing for the Spanish, though, because the Spanish were the ones willing to fund his journey. He makes 4 subsequent journeys, but ultimately sort of dies impoverished. He doesn't find the wealth and the riches and the things that he was looking for. Now, obviously, he doesn't find what he was looking for on the first voyage because he was looking for Indian spices and Asian products. Obviously, he didn't find any of that. but he never finds sort of the massive cache of gold or wealth that obviously a lot of Europeans are going to come west for, right? All people want their little get rich quick scheme. Okay, so understand that about Columbus. Then he does though give rise to a number of other people that come out, whether it's Cabot, da Gama, Soto, Cortez, Vespucci, all sorts of people that are going to come and continue to further explore this new land, this new continent. One of the things that happens even before permanent settlements is you have fishing voyages from England, basically crossing the Atlantic off the coast of Maine, Massachusetts, New York. So sort of what is the northern United States today. They're crossing the Atlantic and they're fishing the waters out there. The Native Americans, the eastern woodland Native Americans, were not massive fishermen, right? And England is existing at a point now where you have sort of population booms and you've got large cities and you've got a lot of people you've got to feed, you have limited resources. Obviously, there's fish around England and in the Mediterranean and in that area, but those waters have been fished pretty heavily. The eastern coast of the United States is pretty much an unspoiled resource at this point, right? So it's very easy to go out there and catch large amounts of fish, and then you just take that fish back to England and you sell it there. Those fishing voyages did have some contact with Native Americans. There's instances of fishing voyages actually picking up natives and bringing them back and trying to interact with one another and have some level of civility. Now, obviously, there's no email, internet, phone, none of that stuff. So when you pick up a Native American off the coast of Massachusetts and then take him all the way back to England, that dude is gone for years, right? The natives, regardless of whether or not he went willingly, are obviously going to believe that he was kidnapped or taken because there's no evidence to the contrary, all right? So that's the early fishing voyages. I do want to at least discuss diseases as far as that goes, right? So as Europeans come to North America, they bring with them a large number of diseases. Now, there are some instances in which it seems like biological warfare was actually the goal, right? Where you have Europeans providing Native Americans with blankets that are infested with the smallpox virus in order to decimate or wipe out Native American populations. But even when that doesn't happen, right, you see significant influx of disease into North America, right? And I want to point out to you, I mean, when you look at some of those diseases, so smallpox, chickenpox, cholera, chlamydia, typhoid, scarlet fever, right, all sorts of diseases are coming from Europe to North America and decimating North American populations. We don't see the same exchange of disease going the other way, right? For the most part. In fact, the only disease that we think might have originated in North America is syphilis, right? The first recorded syphilis outbreak in Europe occurs in the late 1490s in Italy. And so there's a belief that maybe the Italians had gotten it from the French, who got it from the Spanish, who got it from natives. That's sort of the theory. Now, it's important for you to understand why that disease concept is so much worse going from Europe to North America, right? And so here's the thing. In Europe, you already have a couple of things that you didn't have in North America that are significant for the building of the immune system. One, Europe has domesticated animals and kept them in pens, barns, in close proximity to humans, right? Viruses can jump from animals to people. Okay? Secondly, Europeans live in densely populated cities already at this time, right? The closer you are to people, the higher the spread of germs is. So what happens in Europe is you have all of these germs that have spread, and people have built up natural immunities. Now, the germs are still on them, they're just not getting sick from them. They come to North America, where natives had not domesticated animals nearly as frequently, and even domesticated animals that natives did have, like dogs, were not kept sort of packed together the way they were in Europe. Additionally, Native American groups, their tribes, are more spread out. They're more distanced from one another. They don't have massive sort of metropolitan areas that would increase disease and the spreading of germs. So those are some reasons as to why the diseases are so much significantly worse coming from Europe to North America. Right, so we'll look at the Powhatan people first. Right, the Powhatan people are one of the Algonquin-speaking people. Right, they exist here in the Chesapeake Bay region. So if you look at that little map, you'll see sort of northern North Carolina, eastern Virginia, all the way up into southern Maryland and Washington D.C. This is where the Powhatan people lived. You should see on the map, if you can, down there in the bottom right. The James River is there. That's ultimately where Jamestown is sort of coming up and being established. And so there's a whole bunch of different Native American groups that are existing there. The Powhatans are really a confederacy, right? So they are a group that is the nation. We're going to call Powhatans a nation made up of a variety of different bands, and those bands are those small groups that you're seeing there, right? So the bands are the individual, nations, the Rappahannock, the Appomattox. There's a number of different ones in there that make up the larger Powhatan Confederacy, right? There's a very hierarchical system, right? So the individual bands have some sort of chief. The Confederacy as a whole has a chief. That Confederacy chief is going to be the one that decides on things like war. But basically, there is a very complex governmental and economic system where you're providing taxes or tributes to the people that are above you in this hierarchical system, right? So if you're in charge of a band, you're providing, some level of gift or sustenance or whatever to the nation as a whole and to the chief of the nation rather than the tribal leaders, right? But the tribal leaders are getting stuff from the members of the clans, right? The Powhatan people, like a lot of natives, are an agricultural group, right? So they're dealing with what's called in history the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Right? I'm assuming you know what corn and beans are. Squash, there's yellow squash and there's green squash. It's kind of like, looks a little like eggplant in a grocery store, kind of like a zucchini, but it's a vegetable that you could actually make a lot of different ways. They're really not bad. So when you talk about corns, beans, and squash, and then you've got hunting being done by the men, there's a good amount of sustenance in a pretty vibrant and stable agricultural economic system that's going on there, right? The Powhatan people are where we get Pocahontas. That's where she comes from, and I forget exactly which tribe within the Powhatan people she was a member of. But there's a fair amount of misconception, and Disney made the little Pocahontas movie in like 1995 or whatever, and so you see this is one of those examples where Hollywood is taking a story and then sort of drastically changing it. Pocahontas, fell in love with, I think, John Smith in that movie. It is true that Pocahontas did marry a white guy, but she married John Rolfe. She eventually goes back to Europe, where she's sort of, she is dressed up like a white person. They call her Rebecca, and they sort of parade her around. She becomes some sort of the circus sideshow or oddity amongst the high society of England. It's like, look, here's this savage, this native, this woman who hardly wore any clothes, and now we're going to dress her up and make her like a very formal, aristocratic the English person, right? So that's the Powhatan. We're going to stop there for part one because this is all I got through in class. And then moving forward, we're going to be recording while I'm actually lecturing in class. So I will have part two of this lecture posted as well.